All the characters on my channel have extraordinary lives filled with interesting events, albeit mostly immoral and illegal, but today's character can compete for the title of the most interesting story I told you about here. For decades, Gregory Scarpa worked as a secret informant for the FBI, and the agents who supervised him eventually became his associates and helped him avoid prison and conduct illegal business. His informant status also helped Scarpa move within the Colombo Mafia family, of which he was a member. He was very selective in leaking information and distorting facts to eliminate those who hindered him and to increase his power systematically. Some even believe that Scarpa was the grey cardinal of the family, pulling the strings and controlling from behind the scenes. He started wars, killed and ordered the deaths of people by the dozens, turned his son into a killer, officially allowed his wife to have a lover, and then also turned him into a killer. And even when nearing the end of his life, when he turned into a walking skeleton due to advancing AIDS, he still rode around the city and shot his enemies. How's that for a synopsis? Would you like a more detailed story? Then meet Gregory Scarpa on the other side of the law. Not much is known about Gregory Scarpa's early life. He was born in 1928 in Bensonhurst, a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, to a poor Italian-American family. There are also rumors that he was born in Italy and then moved with his parents to the United States at an early age, but I will stick to the first version, taking it from a book written with the participation of his son. In 1949, he married Connie Forrest, with whom he would have a son, Gregory Scarpa Jr. He will also be present in our narrative today. At the time of his son's birth in the early 1950s, Scarpa was already involved in crime, as evidenced by his arrest for burglary. Also in the 1950s, it appears that he became a member of the Mafia family that you all know now as the Colombo family. Its boss at the time was Joe Profassi, who had a conflict with the Gallo brothers in the 1960s, which I talked about in more detail in my video about the brothers. Scarpa at the time was close to Calogero Lo Cicero, better known as Charlie Sige, who was in those years a consigliere. Sige, realizing that the cancer-stricken Profassi would not last long, began making plans to take over the family. However, he was overtaken by Magliocco, who became boss after Profassi's death and demoted Charlie to captain. Sige then began plotting a new plot against Magliocco. Scarpa was even contracted to kill Magliocco, but Sige later called it off for some reason. In the end, Charlie Sige never got the power, and Joe Colombo became the boss. Scarpa, who supported his mentor then, later, when it became clear that Sige's ascension would not happen, had a hand in his own downfall. More on that later. Now, it must be said at this time, Greg Scarpa Sr. was working as an informant. In 1960, he was arrested for armed robbery, and FBI agents began recruiting him. By the fall of 1961, Scarpa had surrendered and agreed to cooperate. He was made a confidential informant and received regular payments for his work. In total, Scarpa would receive more than $150,000 from the authorities for all the time he worked, along with all the bonuses. That's over $1 million in today's equivalent. From that moment on, Greg kept the FBI informed about everything happening inside the American Mafia, especially within the Colombo family. Also, a couple of years before Joe Valachi appeared before the Senate and revealed to the whole country the inner workings of the Mafia, he had already done so privately in conversations with agents. And in general, there is even a version that says all the information Valachi shared was given to him by FBI agents. Proponents of this version believe that such a low-ranking Mafia member like Valachi simply could not have known so much, and through him, Hoover wanted to tell the country everything that the FBI had learned during that time about Cosa Nostra. Why did Hoover need to perform such maneuvers, you might ask? The thing is, much of the information was obtained through not entirely legal means, for example, through wiretapping without permission. So the method of telling everything through Valachi was ideal. As for the setup of the Mafia in this version, FBI agents learned about it from Scarpa, who was much closer to the top being a captain, and then added this data to what Valachi was supposed to reveal to the world. Hoover's ultimate goal in this game was to increase funding. That means agents provided Valachi with all the necessary data. The country learned from Valachi about the true power of the Cosa Nostra, and in turn, the state gave Hoover more money to fight the Cosa Nostra. Whether this was true or not, We won't delve into it, leaving these thoughts to you, our viewers. Instead, as always, we will stick to the facts that are indisputable and important for today's history, and that of course is Scarpa's collaboration with the FBI. Let's go back to that. His collaboration can be roughly divided into official and unofficial. The former included all reports and data that came from Scarpa through the supervising agent to the FBI headquarters. As payment, Scarpa would receive official regular payments and bonuses from the FBI for services rendered. The latter included secret missions that Greg carried out for the FBI, illegal deeds he engaged in with the supervising agent, and the sheltering of Scarpa in cases where he faced a prison sentence. The first, let's be frank, is boring and not particularly interesting to talk about. We will return to this when it comes to how Scarpa fought for power by using official reports to divert suspicions or remove other mafiosi from his path. Let's talk more about the second part and start with the secret missions. According to Scarpa himself, as conveyed to us through the stories of those close to him who knew about his work for the FBI, he had quite a few special operations. He said he helped the government frame members of the Israeli Mossad, assisted in some CIA special operations, gathered information on Howard Hughes and his mafia connections, and even tortured people. Now, we only know details about one of his secret missions for the government, which was indeed related to torture. Were all the others true? I cannot confirm. The mentioned incidents involved the case when, in Ohio, 3 civil rights activists, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. In the summer of 1964, they disappeared without a trace, causing public outrage. The FBI took over the investigation, but despite all efforts, they couldn't find the boys alive or dead. The Bureau suspected the involvement of the Ku Klux Klan but couldn't prove anything. That's when Greg Scarpa was called in. He abducted one of the Klan members and took him to a house deep in the woods. Inside the house, Scarpa started beating the man and demanded to know what happened to those missing boys. When the captive provided some information, Greg would go outside and pass it on to the FBI agents who were waiting outside the house. They would verify the information, and if the man lied, the torture continued. The captive only gave up when Scarpa began cutting off his genitals. He confessed to all those involved in the death of the 3 boys and revealed where the bodies were buried. In the end, the FBI gained fame and honor. Scarpa received several $1,000s and had all his expenses covered, and the man who was kidnapped was not believed by anyone when he claimed he was tortured by some rogue sadist in the FBI's service. Scarpa's main mistress, Linda Shiro, also accompanied him on this mission. Greg had a total of 3 constant women, his wife Connie, Linda, and the beauty queen from Israel, Lily Dajani. However, Linda always remained the primary one, and it must be said that she and Scarpa made a good couple. Scarpa met her shortly before the mission we talked about earlier. He was around 40 years old, and she had just turned 18. Initially, their relationship was like something out of a romantic movie. However, Linda started feeling restricted in her role as the mistress. She wanted Greg to divorce his wife. Scarpa had no intention of doing that, but he was willing to live together with Linda and start a family without getting legally married. This didn't satisfy Linda. She was Catholic and wanted their children to be baptized according to all the rules, with the father and the mother. When she couldn't convince Greg to divorce his wife, she decided to marry someone else. Her plan was as follows: find a gullible guy, charm him into marrying her, have children with Scarpa, baptize them, and then divorce the guy. This way, in her view, there would be no questions from God. However, Scarpa had reservations about this idea. Nevertheless, Scarpa couldn't do anything about Linda's plan, and she carried out her plan anyway. The poor guy she chose was a man named Charlie Shiro. They got married in March 1968. Linda lived with Charlie, but spent all her free time with Greg. Scarpa would be at the Shiro family's home when Charlie was at work. Linda would disappear for a couple of days without explaining much to her husband. Charlie, for a long time, found justifications for the chaos around him. Naturally, this situation couldn't last forever. Charlie found out about the affair after the birth of their first child, who was, of course, Greg's, but he couldn't do anything. He knew about Greg's reputation and simply waited for Linda to tire of playing this game. This happened after the birth of Greg's second child. Linda decided it wasn't worth continuing the charade and divorced Charlie. If you think their personal lives became a more traditional union after that, you'd be mistaken. Greg found himself another mistress. Lily Dajani, and Linda decided she deserved a lover on the side as well, preferably young and energetic, to make their infidelity worth it. Whether this was true infidelity in the traditional sense of the word is hard to say. Linda told Greg about her plan to see other people on the side. He didn't object, and they both concluded that Linda had the right to do so, and moreover, they thought it would bring new emotions to their own intimate lives. This time, Linda chose a guy named Larry Mazza, who delivered groceries to their home. It wasn't difficult for Linda to seduce him, and soon they became lovers. Linda would tell him her husband wasn't home, and they would do as they pleased. Often, this was a lie, and at that moment, Scarpa would be in another room. When Mazza left, Greg and Linda, excited by what had happened, would be intimate. At some point, Linda thought it would be nice for Greg and Charlie to meet in person so that Scarpa could help her lover with work since he didn't really like his job as a courier. Under a pretext manufactured for Mazza, this meeting happened and Scarpa offered him a job. He sponsored Larry, who then opened a betting station for an illegal lottery. Gradually, Scarpa involved Mazza more in his illegal activities, eventually making him one of the hitmen on his team. The issue of Mazza sleeping with his wife was also openly discussed with him, as it greatly troubled Mazza. He even thought the meeting where Scarpa talked about it would be his last, but he was lucky, and this strange love triangle lasted for about 15 years. In addition to Mazza, Scarpa also introduced his elder son, Greg Scarpa Jr., whom I will refer to as Junior, into the criminal world. Junior saw from a very young age the world his father belonged to, as he and his associates often gathered at their home to discuss matters or divide the spoils. Junior didn't fully understand, of course, but he sensed something. Scarpa fully revealed to him who he was when Junior was a teenager. He took him for a walk and told him he was in the Mafia and worked for the government. He presented it all as helping the country. His main job was with the FBI, and Scarpa likened himself to something like James Bond. Later, Junior of course realized the true situation, but this story clearly made a big impression on the young teenager. It was at this time that Scarpa began to introduce violence into his son's life. For example, when Junior was 15, he got into a fight in a bar with an older guy. Scarpa found out about it, took his son, and together they went to that bar. Greg brutally beat up this guy, then made his son kick the man's body when he had already lost consciousness. About a year after this incident, Junior participated in a boxing competition. One of the fights was very tough and Junior lost by a decision of the judges. Scarpa then forced him to find that guy after the fight and beat him up outside the ring. Junior couldn't find the guy, but this incident serves as a vivid example of the kind of upbringing Scarpa provided. Greg couldn't even entertain the thought of someone being stronger than his son or insulting him, and he compelled Junior to behave in the same way. When Junior came of age, Scarpa started involving him in his illegal activities. Gradually, this led to discussions about killings. Scarpa gave him detailed instructions on how to kill properly, how to dispose of bodies, and how to ensure not getting caught. Junior wasn't particularly fond of that conversation, but he was loyal to his father and didn't object. Soon, this loyalty would lead to him being responsible for dozens of his own killings, with Greg Scarpa Sr. being the main contractor, of course. As I mentioned earlier, Junior was aware that Scarpa was working for the FBI. His first handler was an agent named Anthony Villano. Scarpa told his team that he had an acquaintance in law enforcement, but didn't specify who or where precisely. Naturally, everyone thought it was some cop whom they needed to pay occasionally. It was an FBI agent, and there's plenty of evidence that he regularly received money from Scarpa, not to mention that they sometimes worked together. For instance, Scarpa's men could steal, let's say, 100 cases of whiskey. Scarpa would take his share of 20 cases and then inform Villano of where to find the rest. With this information, Villano would approach those responsible for compensating for the losses, which were often insurance companies. Villano would go to the insurance company and say he knew where they could find a batch of whiskey worth $60,000. However, he would only reveal the location if they paid him $10,000. To reduce costs, companies usually pay up. Sometimes, in addition to this, the FBI would investigate the theft, and Scarpa would receive a bonus from the government for the valuable information. So, from one theft, Greg would get a portion of the stolen goods, money from the insurance company, and a bonus from the government on top. Even with sharing with Villano, it was a remarkable plan, as reliable as Swiss watches. There's also some unverified information that Villano and later his replacement, Lynn DeVito, were involved in thefts. This version suggests that during, for example, a bank break-in, the FBI agent would be in the car tracking details of the incident known to the authorities on special radio waves. If he learned that the police had received a signal about suspicious activity in the bank, he immediately informed Scarpa's people about it. Of course, if the agents were directly involved in Scarpa's affairs, it wasn't in all of them. They covered for him and received some money, but it wasn't a widespread collaboration. Scarpa also had activities that he dealt with separately. Firstly, the information about FBI agents' involvement isn't verified, and secondly, even if they were involved, it wasn't always the case. Scarpa's theft team operated regularly, often hitting banks and jewelry stores. The crew had their own amusement as well. One of the guys invented a lockpick that easily cracked open the coin compartment in a phone booth. Even Scarpa himself practiced this. Scarpa's theft operation was probably the most exclusive. Out of about 50 guys in the so-called Wimpy Boys team, named after Scarpa's social club, only about 10 could be considered professional thieves. Another 10 to 15 could be called hired hitmen. They had other jobs and earnings, of course, but the burden of elimination usually fell on them. Even more exclusive was probably the group of car thieves who specialized in stealing luxury cars. Scarpa's people would make these cars impossible to trace and resell. Partly in the same category were those who robbed trucks carrying various goods ranging from clothes and electronics to food. These guys would earn approximately $5,000 to $10,000 per truck depending on the cargo inside. There were also those engaged in illegal lotteries, bookmaking and loan sharking. All paid a percentage to Scarpa. For instance, he gave $80,000 to loan sharks who were to issue loans on the streets. In return, Scarpa demanded $100 per week for every $10,000 the loan shark handed out. The loan shark himself would earn around $300 to $400 from the same $10,000. Overall, it was quite a lucrative job, especially given that everyone was aware of the reputation of your boss, and collecting money wasn't that difficult. Continuing the list, one cannot exclude mentioning drug traffickers, who were also present on Scarpa's team, and even Junior was involved in this trade. The most notorious group on Greg's team was the so-called muscles. These were strong guys who specialized in intimidation. If a debtor didn't pay his loan, these guys were sent. If a businessman being extorted didn't pay up, these guys were sent. In essence, you get the idea. Breaking legs and arms was their specialty. As seen from the above, Scarpa and his team were involved in practically everything that could make them money, including fraud. Greg particularly enjoyed credit card fraud. He would buy duplicate cards, then send his people to make purchases with them, and finally sell the bought goods to get cash. These cards were also used for everyday expenses like groceries or dining out. The income from this fraud amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. For example, in 1985, when an agent of the United States Secret Service sold 300 credit cards to Scarpa undercover for $9,000, if Scarpa had used all of them, he could have made over $1 million. However, instead of that, Greg was charged with fraud. He faced 7 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. However, the FBI intervened, and it turned out that Scarpa hadn't paid the $9,000 for the credit cards, but only promised to consider the purchase. The judge was also informed of Scarpa's merits as an informant, and overall, the authorities decided that the Secret Service could find someone else to put behind bars. Consequently, Greg received only a 5-year suspended sentence and a $10,000 fine. By the time this happened, his FBI handler was no longer Villano, but DeVito, who didn't differ much from his predecessor. Villano stopped working with Scarpa in the mid-1970s. He faced an internal investigation which led to his transfer from New York, and soon he retired altogether. Scarpa, on the other hand, completely ended his work with the FBI in 1975. He was persuaded to return in 1980 by agent Lynn DeVito, whom Greg quickly swayed to the dark side, just like Villano. Scarpa provided DeVito with information about individuals who hindered his rise to power or were simply different to him in the American Mafia. DeVito covered for Greg when he broke the law, and according to some reports, he was indirectly involved in several of Scarpa's killings. Typically, Lynn either provided information on their whereabouts or alerted Greg when he heard that someone wanted to talk to the authorities. For instance, This was the case with Scarpa's close friend, Joe Brewster DiDomenico. DeVito heard that Joe intended to speak to the police, which could have been detrimental to both Scarpa and DeVito. Thus, Greg had to give the order to kill Brewster. Scarpa and DeVito quickly found common ground and a shared goal where murder and abuse of authority were acceptable tools. This goal was, unsurprisingly, to increase Scarpa's power in the Mafia, which also allowed DeVito to climb the career ladder. The ultimate goal was to make Greg or his puppet the boss of the Colombo family, to have an informant at the top level of the entire American Mafia, which could facilitate bringing down the entire organization like a house of cards. To substantiate these claims, let's consider a few concrete examples of this double game. Let's start with how Scarpa got rid of Charlie Sige, mentioned at the very beginning of the video. When Charlie wielded significant influence in the Colombo family, Scarpa spoke favorably of him in reports to the FBI, but he willingly provided information about his crimes. However, when Sige started losing power and hitting rock bottom, Scarpa changed his rhetoric. He started to almost insult Charlie when giving information about him to the agents. As it turned out, this was a very calculated game. Seeing Sige's weakness, Greg began plotting a very cunning conspiracy against him. Pay attention now. Scarpa slowly started feeding the FBI information that Sige had very bad relationships with his sons. Then Greg either made a deal with Sige's grandson, Richard, or simply robbed him when Richard was at work transporting company stocks worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from one place to another. Scarpa told the FBI that he had nothing to do with it, but knew where some of the stocks were kept. The agents found them there. Scarpa also implied that Sige might have been behind the robbery because one of Charlie's men contacted Greg with an offer to buy the stocks. Richard was summoned to answer questions before a grand jury. Sometime later, Richard was found dead. Immediately after his death, the chief assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, Elliot Golden, named Richard a star witness, thus confirming the motive for his murder. Fears that he had started cooperating with the authorities. The primary suspicion in the murder fell on Charlie Sige. Later, it became known that Scarpa was aware of the illegal dealings between Golden and Joe Colombo, and although there's no direct evidence of this, one could speculate that he may have pressured Golden to make a statement about the star witness, thereby justifying the motive for Richard's murder by Charlie Sige. When the entire web was woven, Charlie Sige himself was killed, and all suspicions fell on his son Frank, who supposedly avenged Richard's death. Thus, Scarpa removed the first obstacle in his path, an old man who knew too much about him but had now hit rock bottom, making it hard to foresee his actions. Let's move on and turn to Joe Colombo. If the whole setup with Sige was more for personal safety, the situation with Colombo was more about power struggle. Scarpa acted more discreetly here. His strategy was akin to water dripping on concrete over time, eventually punching a hole through it. In simpler terms, he tried to utilize every opportunity to harm Colombo. In 1967, he informed the FBI of the location of Colombo's son's wedding, and undercover agents managed to capture several new faces. A year later, Scarpa reported Colombo's son, who wanted to melt down silver coins and sell them as precious metal at a higher value than their nominal worth. When Colombo's son was arrested, Joe staged a multi-day picket, and Scarpa helped him with that while simultaneously keeping the FBI informed of Colombo's plans. Scarpa was also one of the most active members of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, supposedly established by Colombo to protect the rights of Italian Americans, which further cemented Greg's relationship with the boss. After that, information began to flow to the FBI about Colombo's earnings and the corrupt connections that he had at his disposal. And now we are approaching a very interesting version of why and whom Joe Colombo was killed. It happened at a rally organized by Colombo in the summer of 1971. He was shot by a black man named Jerome Johnson, which led Colombo to fall into a lengthy coma and later die. I've already discussed two main versions of this incident in my videos. One blames Joe Gallo, while the other blames Carlo Gambino. It is generally believed that it was indeed Gambino. More details about this can be found in my video about Carlo Gambino and the Gallo brothers. Scarpa was pushing the FBI's version that it was Joe. At first, he said that all was well between Colombo and Gallo, but shortly before the assassination, he radically changed his opinion and started to say that a war might break out soon. He mentioned that Colombo feared an attack. One of the signs that Joe Colombo considered was a car with African Americans circulating in his neighborhood. Scarpa told the agents that Colombo believed they were friends of Joe Gallo, whom he had befriended in prison. Moreover, after the assassination had taken place, Scarpa was able to tell the FBI a surprising amount about the shooter, even though neither the police nor other informants knew much about Johnson. All of this raises the idea that Colombo might have been killed by Scarpa, who shifted all the blame onto Joe Gallo. However, in this case, these are only speculations, as all the evidence in this regard is too indirect. However, we do not know for certain that after Colombo, Scarpa immediately shifted his focus to Carmine Persico, who would later become the new boss of the family. The first thing Scarpa did was accuse Persico of killing Joe Gallo, but that was just the beginning. Greg provided the FBI with enough information for them to obtain wiretaps on the phones of mobsters involved in the so-called Mafia Commission trial, which resulted in multiple bosses being imprisoned due to a conspiracy known as the Concrete Club. The essence of this scheme was that mobsters from different families conspired and took over the construction industry in New York, extorting money from construction firms. Scarpa also provided the FBI with an address where members of the Colombo family, Soldier Ralph Scopo, Underboss Gennaro Langella, and Captain Dominic Montemarano were discussing matters related to the Concrete Club. FBI agents installed listening devices there. These recordings, among others, led to the arrest of the mobsters as well as the arrest of family boss Carmine Persico, who ended up in prison for 100 years in the late 1980s. With a couple of informants and the help of others, Scarpa quickly eliminated 3 higher-ranking members of the family. However, he had no intention of stopping, even though by that time he was fatally ill. The illness began with persistent back pain. The cause was unknown, but Greg fought it by regularly taking painkillers. This in turn led to gastrointestinal diseases, culminating in internal bleeding in 1986. Doctors performed an operation and saved Scarpa's life, but he also needed a blood transfusion. Familiar acquaintances and associates of Greg became donors. Among them was a 29-year-old bodybuilder named Paul Mealy. Shortly after the blood transfusion, Mealy passed away. It turned out that he had contracted AIDS from intramuscular injections of anabolic steroids with the same needle as several other bodybuilders. His weakened immune system couldn't fight off pneumonia. Scarpa then got tested and the results were bleak. He was also infected. He fought the disease as best he could, but it inexorably took its toll. Nevertheless, this did not stop him from continuing to scheme and kill people. By the early 1990s, Scarpa found himself in the leading role in the bloodiest mafia war of that decade, named the Third Colombo War. The most common version of its beginning suggests that the acting boss, Vic Orena, decided to rebel against Carmine Persico, who was the true boss and was incarcerated. However, there is another version where Scarpa is depicted as the puppet master who initiated this war. Orena was short of the antithesis of Scarpa. Vic made his money mostly from non-violent crimes and was against the drug trade. He was also loyal to the Persico faction of the family for most of his mafia career, and Carmine trusted him so much that he made him his acting boss when he went to prison in the late 1980s for the Mafia Commission trial. Scarpa didn't like this arrangement, and he started to get closer to Orena on the one hand, and on the other hand, to make it look like Vic believed in him so much that he wanted to betray Persico and take full power into his own hands. He carried out the former with the help of a guy named Carmine Cesar, who had been working with his team as a partner for a long time. Scarpa first lobbied for Cesar's admission into the family, where he was placed on Vic Orena's team, and then, as Cesar grew closer to Orena, he had his eyes and ears in the camp of his main opponent in the power struggle. Cesar played his role so skillfully that Orena started to trust him a lot and helped him with his career in the mafia too. Thus, with one secret and one obvious patron, Cesar literally went from a soldier to a consigliere in a matter of years. However, it should be noted that Scarpa's loyalty was based more on fear than on love. On the one hand, Cesar did have a good relationship with Orena. Vic even helped him distance himself from Scarpa, but Greg scared Cesar too much for him to break the bond completely. Also, rumors were constantly circulating in the mafia that Scarpa was an informant. No one could prove anything, but that scared Cesar too. for Greg knew where the bodies of the people Sessa had killed on his orders were hidden. Scarpa realized that his fear of him alone would not be enough to make Sessa go against Arena. He had gotten too close to him, and it would be foolish to dismiss the fact that Carmine might have betrayed Greg. However, Scarpa had already decided to get Vic out of his way and started weaving his web again. In 1988, Arena asked Sessa to kill the family's consigliere, Jimmy Angelino. Scarpa convinced Carmine that the murder was because Arena had recently asked Angelino to poll the captains on whether they supported Persico's rule. When Angelino did so, however, Arena eliminated him. It would later turn out that Angelino was killed for a different reason, generally on the orders of Persico himself. But when, sometime later, Sessa himself was appointed consigliere and Arena asked him to make the same inquiry, Carmine became nervous. Scarpa, on the other hand, added fuel to the fire and told him that he had heard that Sessa was being prepared to be assassinated when he went to the ceremony of accepting new members, which he, as consigliere, was obliged to attend. Eventually, Sessa, under pressure from Scarpa, decided to kill Arena, but the attempt was unsuccessful. After this, the family split into two factions. One sided with Arena and the other with Persico, who, as I understand, was by this time convinced that Arena was indeed plotting a coup. There were talks for a while, both between the factions and with other families, but in November 1991, there was a complete assassination attempt on Scarpa, signaling the start of a full-scale war. Greg himself was involved in 4 murders in this confrontation. He himself, already looking more like a walking skeleton due to advanced AIDS, traveled around New York with a gun, looking for enemies and mercilessly shot and killed them. However, Arena was still alive, and then Scarpa began to realize his other plan. If he could not kill Vic, he decided to put him away, especially since the base for this was already prepared. This was about the murder of Tommy Osera, for which Arena was eventually imprisoned. Osera was killed by Scarpa because Tommy guessed that Greg was an informant and started talking to other gangsters about it. We know this from the testimony of Greg Scarpa Jr. We also know from them that when the Colombo War broke out and it became clear Scarpa couldn't kill Arena, he planted the guns from that crime on Vic, and the Vecchio initiated Arena's apprehension. In fact, Vic was convicted because of circumstantial evidence in the spirit that someone heard something, someone saw something, and because of a weapon that was planted on him that had no prints on it. You could say that after his imprisonment, the war stopped. And so did Scarpa's multi-pronged scheme. If before I tell you about the 4 of the Grim Reaper, as Greg was called, I want to take a moment to tell you about the murders he committed, for this aspect is very important in understanding the character of this man. We have previously talked about the murders of Charlie Sige and Joe Brewster, as well as mentioning the 4 murders during Colombo's Third War. But Scarpa didn't stop there. There was also Dominic Sommer, who complained to family captain Anthony Scarpati about Scarpa Jr. being insubordinate during a heist. Greg remembered this and waited patiently for Sommer to make a mistake so he could get permission from the family boss to kill him. When that happened, Scarpa pulled the trigger of the gun himself. There was also his mistress, Lily Dajani's lover, who was going to talk to the IRS about Scarpa and Dajani's joint business interests. Greg also personally shot him. One time, he personally killed a man in his social club who owed money to his loan shark, and another time, he killed a regular limousine driver for insulting Scarpa Jr. Greg also killed another driver when he found out he was trying to molest his daughter. I've chosen these examples out of about 24 murders attributed to Scarpa to show you that Greg could kill for just about anything, from a power struggle to a simple insult. The next 2 examples are meant to demonstrate that, for his own safety, he could go to the extent of killing even those closest to him. The first example is the death of Scarpa's older brother, Salvatore. By the end of the 1980s, their relationship wasn't the best, and Salvatore, seeing how his brother repeatedly evaded accusations, the latest of which were almost a sure case involving credit cards, began to speak about suspecting Greg of working for the government. Scarpa killed him for this. The second example is Gus Ferrasi, who was Scarpa's nephew. He was quite close to Greg and worked on his crew. However, when Ferrasi killed a Drug Enforcement Administration agent, Scarpa publicly distanced himself from him in an interview, fearing that such a connection could harm him, as Ferrasi was a major target for law enforcement agencies. Several New York Mafia families were interested in Ferrazzi's murder, and Scarpa either helped them find his nephew or killed him himself. Greg was never punished for any of these murders, all thanks to his FBI guardian angel, Lynn DeVito. However, DeVito was not omnipotent, and his subordinates were beginning to suspect more and more that their boss was not just supervising the most valuable informant, but was playing a double game. Agent Chris Favo proved to be the most incredulous. He had long suspected DeVito, but was finally convinced when the loan shark Carmine Imbriali was arrested. This guy began to cooperate with the authorities and told them that he had heard Scarpa bragging at dinner that he had killed a man. The prosecutor's office, to whom Imbriali told this, passed the information on to Chris Favo, who reported it to DeVito, and within a couple of days, Imbriali said there was a rumor on the streets that Scarpa wanted to kill him. Favo easily traced the pattern here, but couldn't believe it yet. The final straw for Favo, which tipped the scales towards refusing to trust his boss, was a conversation with DeVito after the murder of arena supporter Larry Lampasi. When Favo informed DeVito of this, he replied, "Yeah, we're definitely going to win." It wasn't hard to guess that DeVito was referring specifically to the war that was going on in the Colombo family. As an FBI agent, much less the superior of the teams that oversaw capturing members of the Bonanno and Colombo families, he had no right to emphasize with anyone in an armed conflict. This clearly showed that DeVito was engaged and taking Scarpa's side. Favo began to act without consulting DeVito as much as possible. Thus, he installed desiccant devices in the home and car of Scarpa team member Joseph Ambrosino. Those records helped link Scarpa to 2 murders and 1 attempted murder. In March 1992, the Brooklyn District Attorney Office obtained an arrest warrant for Scarpa on charges of weapon possession after 2 officers witnessed him dropping a gun from his car window. DeVito was meeting with Scarpa during this period but did not arrest him or inform the prosecution of his whereabouts. Meanwhile, Favo, circumventing DeVito, obtained an arrest warrant for Scarpa for conspiring to commit murder at the same time. Favo received it and began waiting. Greg, completely unsuspectingly and assured by DeVito that everything was fine and he had nothing to worry about, first appeared in court over an issue with poorly sanitized blood at a hospital that infected him with AIDS, where he won $350,000. He then decided to attend the court proceedings for the illegal possession of a firearm. It was here that Favo arrested him as he left the courtroom. By that time, Scarpa's health was terrible and he looked like a walking skeleton. His imprisonment only worsened his condition. He lost more weight, showed signs of dementia and other mental impairments, and it became increasingly difficult for him to move each day. His relatives managed to have Greg placed under house arrest due to his health. However, Scarpa wouldn't be himself if he complied with the rules of his house arrest. One day, his son from Linda named Joseph told him about an altercation he had with 2 drug dealers. Joseph was involved in drugs and the argument was business related. Greg refused to listen. He grabbed a gun, got into the car with his son and his friend, and went to find these guys. Upon finding them, Scarpa initiated a shootout in which Greg himself lost an eye and his son's friend died. After this incident, he was returned to prison. Scarpa didn't defend himself in court. On May 6, 1993, Greg Scarpa Jr. pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and conspiracy to commit more murders. He faced a life sentence without parole. However, considering his health, the judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. In the later stages of his life, Greg Scarpa Sr. was bedridden, with his body covered in sores, even in his mouth and throat, making it difficult and painful for him to eat and drink. He passed away on June 4, 1994. After his death, Linda Shiro received no help from the Colombo family. Rumors suggest that she had developed romantic relations with Lynn DeVito. DeVito's own fate turned out to be better than expected. After Favo reported his suspicions to DeVito's superiors, the FBI launched an internal investigation but ultimately closed it with the conclusion of no justification for investigation. Despite several witnesses from Scarpa's past claiming that DeVito had corrupt relations with Greg, no action was taken against DeVito. The government believed addressing this issue could lead to a review of dozens of mafia-related cases, so Lynn DeVito quietly completed his 30 years in the FBI and retired. Less fortunate was the fate of Greg Scarpa Jr. He was imprisoned in 1988 and spent over 30 years, most of it in the strictest US prison, ADX Florence. He was released in 2020. Scarpa's other son, Joseph, was killed.